Hello everyone, in this video we're going to discuss our lab report from experiment 3B, energy. You can start marking your lab report as you go along with this video. We start with the first item, and that is the title. By writing the title of this experiment, you are rewarded with 1 mark, that is J1. The next item is the objective of this experiment, that is to verify the law of conservation of energy. Remember, we're going to go back to this objective once we're writing down the conclusion of this experiment. You write down the objective, 1 mark, J1. Now let's go to the data tabulation or the observation. Here we have distance between photo gates, distance h with the correct unit centimeters, the time with the uncertainty plus minus 0.000001 second. That is 6 decimal places, 6 dp. The third mark for this experiment is when you write down the unit for the velocity, meter per second. The fourth mark is given when you write down the unit for the velocity squared, that is meter squared per second squared. Now let's go to the data that you have calculated. The first one, that is T average. If all the 7 data is correct with 6 decimal places as the uncertainty, because you have to follow the decimal places of the measuring instrument, you're going to reward 2 marks. If one data is wrongly calculated or the decimal places is wrong, not 6 dp, 1 mark. More than 2 wrongs, 0 mark. Next is the calculated data for your velocity. Your calculated data velocity and the velocity squared can be rounded off to 2 or 3 decimal places, but you have to be consistent. If you want to use 2, make sure it is 2 throughout your data, or 3, throughout the data. You cannot just 2 and then sometimes 3. You can't. Once again, for your v and v squared, if they are consistently 2 or 3 decimal places and they are all correctly calculated, then you can get 2 marks. 1 wrong, 1 mark, and more than 2 wrongs, 0 marks. Oh, one more thing. It is advisable for your velocity and your velocity squared data to be written or converted to SI unit, because if you put it in centimeter per second, the data will be so big and it's not really suitable for your graph plotting later. But if you still want to use the centimeters, then you have to put the scientific notation, and that is times 10 to the second. Next, we go to calculation of centroid. If you write down your equation, summation of your data, in this case your h, over number of readings, n, you're going to be rewarded with R1. And the substitution, if you write it like this, all your data you include in your calculation, then you can get G1. Same goes for the x-axis quantity v squared, summation of all the data for the v squared over number of reading, R1, and the substitution G1. And lastly, for the centroid, if you write down the coordinate of the centroid together with its correct unit, Ju1. After we have calculated the data and the centroid, let's take a look at the graph plotting. Title of the graph, 1 mark. Label with the correct unit for both axes, 1 mark. Suitable scales for each axis, 1 mark. If the size of the graph is more than 80% of the graph paper, 1 mark. 7 points correctly plotted, 3 marks. 1 data wrongly plotted, 2 marks. 2 data wrongly plotted, 1 mark. 3 or more wrong plottings, 0 mark. Centroid point correctly plotted, 1 mark. For the centroid, make sure you circle the plotting. This is to distinguish between the centroid and the other data plotting. Best line, when it's balanced for best fit line, and pass through centroid and as many plot as possible, 1 mark. Draw the triangle and the size of the triangle is more than half of the graph, 1 mark. Next, we go to the calculation of the gradient. You write down the equation like this, R1. The substitution, G1. The answer with the correct unit, Ju1. In determining the value of gravitational acceleration, you have to compare it with the equation of this experiment. That is v squared equals to 2gh. Compare it with the straight line equation, y equals to mx plus c. The quantity along the y-axis is the v squared. The quantity along the x-axis is the height. The gradient is the 2g, and the y-intercept is 0. And when you compare the gradient with the equals to 2g, that is k1. You do substitution, you get g1. And of course, your final answer, Ju1. Let's see how many marks we can get for the percentage of difference. If you write down this equation, R1 for you, substitution G1, and your final answer with the correct symbol percent, Ju1. You also have to make comments on the percentage difference. State the experimental value, whether it is greater, less, or equals to the experimental value. And you have to state whether the experiment value verifies the law of conservation of energy. And you have to give comment about it. Here is one example. Let's go to discussion. Any 3 reasonable precautions? 3 marks. The sandwich photo gates is placed exactly parallel to the free-fall adapter and the table. All connecting wires are connected properly to the right terminal of the timer, and the 2 switch photo gates. The trigger of the free-fall adapter must be pressed gently to avoid undesired impulsive force on the ball bearing upon release. The fan is switched off in order to avoid wind and air resistance. And finally, the contact between the observer and the table is avoided as less as possible. This is to prevent the vibration on the apparatus. For the errors and ways to overcome, for your error, remember that you cannot take any point that you have stated in your precaution. For example, if you have taken parallax error as your precaution, you cannot use it anymore as your error. Because if you do, then it's like you're repeating the very mistake that you want to avoid. So any 3 logic errors, 3 marks. And 3 ways to overcome the error, 3 marks. And lastly, for the conclusion, write down the experimental value that you have analyzed in this experiment, and you also have to mention the objective of this experiment. And you can write it like this. Based on the experiment, the value of gravitational acceleration is 10 meters per second, and the law of conservation of energy is verified. That's all.